radio. We are apologetics.com radio, and we are here to challenge believers to think and thinkers to believe. Our topic for tonight is on the resurrection. You know, next week, gentlemen, we're going to be celebrating Easter.
Yes.
It is one of the greatest events in history, and we get to celebrate that as a church body. It's important that we get to know what the resurrection's all about and what that means for the world. So my friends are with me here tonight, and they're going to help us discuss what the resurrection's all about, what are some of the objections to it, and I know when I talked to you guys about it, I know Lenny said, this should be in our wheelhouse.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is one of those important things that if you are a follower of Jesus, this is something that you ought to know, because our faith is based on this. The Apostle Paul said, if the resurrection didn't take place, we are to be pitied. Mm-hmm. And, you know, this is all for naught, really.
Right.
What are we doing here, right? So the resurrection, as one author said, the relevance of the resurrection to the question of Jesus' claim to be divine is that if it occurred, it presents a signature of God on the life, teachings, and claims of Jesus of Nazareth. So our entire faith rests on the whether or not Jesus did rise from the grave. So that's what we're going to do tonight. But before we get into it, I always want to ask how you guys are doing. Any news from the various ministries that you represent? Lenny, how are you doing? How's Come Reason?
Doing well, yeah. Moving forward, lots of interviews, lots of podcast material. Of course, YouTube channel is going well. Prepping for my trip to Europe, where I'm going to lead a group of people on the footsteps of the apostles. So we're going to retrace some of these areas where, Paul made headway, proclaiming this message of the resurrection that wasn't accepted carte blanche. I mean, a lot of people think, those people 2,000 years ago, they were so ignorant, they were so gullible, they would take this. You know what? People knew death back then. I often tell folks who are skeptical, I say, they knew death better than we did, because we take our elderly and we shove them away in hospice centers and hospitals and things where we don't have to deal with it. Most of those folks, they had to experience death with their loved one at home, right? They saw death occur quite often, so they knew what death was. So when Paul goes to Athens, for example, and preaches Jesus' resurrection, people were aghast, right? So, that's when they start making fun of him. Yeah. So it's not like the ancient folks were just these gullible folks. And so anyway, that's part of what we're going to explore at this trip, but it leads back into our talk today.
That's great.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because one of the claims is made is that Christians basically borrowed the idea of resurrection from ancient Greek gods and all. But here in Acts 17, verse 18, it says, a group of Epicureans and Stoic philosophers began to debate with him. Some of them asked, what is this babbler trying to say? Others remarked, he seems to be advocating a foreign gods.
Right.
They said this because Paul was preaching the good news and about Jesus and the resurrection. So if they already knew about resurrection, they would be familiar with what Paul is preaching. But they are saying that he's preaching foreign gods.
Yeah, and they're calling him a babbler. Well, he's not making any sense to us.
Right,
exactly.
Right. So you're saying it wasn't foreign.
It wasn't.
Yeah, it was a known thing already. It was circulating.
The idea of resurrection, bodily resurrection, was a new idea that Paul was bringing.
Yeah.
So it wasn't reincarnation. It wasn't coming back into some other form.
Yeah.
It was the bodily resurrection was a new idea even for people in Athens.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Jacob Daniel, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Looks like we already entered into our show.
I know, exactly. I love it. But I want to ask you, how are things at Heritage Council?
Going well. Yeah, I'm really glad for the time we had at the Gateway Seminary. We had over 250 in attendance, and went really well. The link is now available on Gateway Seminary's YouTube channel, so if anyone's interested, they can look up. The title was Truth Across Culture.
That's
and I'm
great.
looking forward to the engagements coming forward in next month. So, yeah, great.
No, that's good. So are saying that the resurrection or Easter is not about Easter eggs and bunnies, I guess.
No,
not really.
Not really. Although those are not necessarily evil symbols. They're all obviously new life.
Sure, exactly.
And so that the whole concept of Easter revolves around new life, and that's an important point.
I'm reminded of this hymn, I Serve a Risen Savior. It was written by A.H. Ackley back in 1933. Very popular. I used to sing it with all my might, every Easter Sunday. But I'm going to mention the chorus here, and then I want to use that as a springboard to our conversation tonight. It crescendos. I love it. It's one of those hymns where it's like every quarter note is just a really strong, note with the words, easy to sing. But it crescendos into this chorus. He lives, Christ Jesus lives today. He walks with me, talks with me along life's narrow way. He lives, salvation to impart. And then it kind of slows down because it's set up for this this climax. You ask me how I know he lives. He lives within my heart. When I was young, it's like, yes. And as we've matured in our faith, at least in my faith, and studying apologetics and, hanging out with you guys, I hope that our response could be more than just saying, you ask me how I know he lives, that I hope my answer is not just, I know it because he lives within my heart.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because while it's a nice song, it's a good hymn, I think we should still sing it. Well, I'm not even sure anymore, actually. But it wouldn't be singable, right? If we say, well, you asked me how I know he lives. Well, let me tell you.
And it's a song, sounds like it's a hymn that a Hindu can sing or a Buddhist can sing, even a Muslim can sing.
That's right.
Right. What makes the Christian faith unique is the claim that Christ lives eternally in his bodily, resurrected and glorified state.
Yeah, isn't it interesting? We spent quite a bit of time understanding how our culture has shifted from an external verity, an external idea of truth, to a feelings-based culture, and how this hymn pulls on one's feelings as the ultimate arbiter of, you ask me how I know. Knowledge is based on feelings. Whereas Christianity has always been separate from all other faith traditions in the fact that it's historical first. The resurrection has to be something that happens in history. It has to be something that has a real world location. It's not, Krishna coming down at some unspecified past and doing some things with some kind of mythical people that don't get anchored in history. It is a specific place, a specific time with real people in real history, and that can't be questioned. And that's actually where a lot of people have tried to attack the faith. In fact, what I've noticed, and there's been, it's interesting how once every 2 or 3 decades, a book comes out by an individual who comes to the realization, all I need to do to make Christianity topple, the weak point, the thread upon which Christianity hangs, is this resurrection thing. So if I just snip that thread, then the whole thing tumbles, right? So you have the most recent one, of course, is Lee Strobel, where he starts to investigate the resurrection as a report. But before him, they had Frank Morrison, and he was a reporter in the 30s. And then you had the testimony of the evangelist Simon Greenleaf comes in before that, where his Christian students. Now, Simon Greenleaf is a master at constitutional law and evidentiary approaches to legal matters, and so his Christian students challenged him to say, take the resurrection the way you would any other point of evidence, and check that. And then J. Warner Wallace, we know also. So it's interesting how these guys have done this over and over again, and no matter what the era, it seems to come back in the same way. Yet you can't break it because it's historical.
Yes.
And the experience of Jesus in our heart is true only because it is true in history.
Right.
That's
exactly
true.
That.
That's a good point, Jacob. Yeah. For tonight, though, we owe a debt of gratitude to Dr. Gary Habermas here. So a lot of our points will focus on his work. Now, Dr. Gary Habermas, one of the world's leading experts on the resurrection. In fact, he just came out with a pretty thick tome. I need to get it, but
Volume 1.
That's just Volume 1. All right. So he has dedicated his whole life to the subject of Jesus' resurrection. And if I'm not mistaken, he started that project back in 1975 and had collected thousands of critical scholarly works in that area, even different languages. In his research, he has come up with what he calls the minimalist facts approach. There's 12 of them, but I know there's like 3 that are pretty much agreed upon by virtually every scholar who has ever studied the subject, every New Testament scholar, whether that be ultra-liberal to the Bible thumpers, you know.
Right. There are atheists New Testament scholars.
That's right.
Because they're intrigued with the ancient traditions and the ancient history.
So we can actually just even rule out all of the crazies who say Jesus didn't even exist. I mean, sometimes you hear that, and that's probably just internet memes here and there. But
matter of fact, Gary told me that there were even 3 Jewish New Testament scholars, which is not that many, but there are 3 Jewish.
I thought there was at least 1.
Yeah.
But that's interesting. You wonder, all right, but Jesus is not the Messiah in your worldview? You know, that is interesting.
Yeah.
But
if we see culturally, there's happening a shift. If we see myth is being historicized, and history is being mythologized. So that's what's happening. Even with you talk about Jesus, he's being made into a legend, a myth, whereas you talk about Krishna in the Eastern context, they're trying to situate him in history.
Interesting.
So there's that shift happening in culture.
Well, just a quick summary. Ancient historical texts, or you want to call them the New Testament, the Gospels, talks about this man, Jesus, the God-man. He died, and he was buried 3 days, and on the 3rd day, he rose from the grave. That we know. All right, so let's go through some of the explanations as to why the skeptics might explain it away. Let's start with, we'll try to cover a lot of them, and then, you know, we invite your call, by the way. If you have a specific question about the resurrection, please give us a call at 888-995-KKLA. The number again is 888-995-5552. Give us a call with your questions. You might have an opinion about it. We'd love to talk to you. All right. We are live tonight, and we are talking about the resurrection. So again, Jesus rose again from the grave, contra Rudolf Bultmann, the German higher critic, who says, well, dead men don't rise, right? Okay, well, those guys have presuppositions, and we want to identify some of those. So I'm going to play devil's advocate, right? So let's say, all right, you're telling me that 2,000 years ago, Jesus died, was buried for 3 days, and then rose again. But what if his followers just went to the wrong tomb, or it was an unknown tomb? What would you say to them?
Well, first of all, it's a little problematic in 3 reasons. Whenever a traumatic event like this happens, you tend to remember. I know people often say, well, eyewitness testimony is fleeting, right? And they've done the psychology tests where they would have a guy run into the classroom and wave a prop gun and, you know, then run out, right? And the students are all shocked and amazed. And then the psychology prof then says, okay, I want, you know, everybody write down a description of the person and what happened. And they compare notes and they say, you see how varied these experiences are, how psychology can, you know, play on you. That's a little different than, say, 9/11. When you're seeing something happen in real time that's shocking, that's that makes that big. Everybody remembers where they were 9/11, right? You could still, because it was that big of a deal. Or if your grandparent is passing away and it's happening over a course of many hours, I mean, sometimes you can even feel that still. So first of all, it's a big deal. Tombs weren't that common either. Going to the wrong tomb, it's like, no, fresh tombs, that's actually a new deal.
Yeah.
So that's
it was
the
a
first,
known tomb too.
It was a known tomb. So that's the first problem. Secondly, you have temple guards who have made the tomb secure. And how would they get it wrong?
Yeah.
Because they're right. The women are saying, we got to get the stone rolled away, and we got to deal with this stuff still. So you have the temple guards who, were they guarding the wrong tomb then? What's the story there? And then thirdly, if it was the wrong tomb, then the easiest way for the Jewish hierarchy to unplug the entire movement is to say, look, you got the wrong tomb, let me bring out the body.
Yeah. Right. And some of Jesus' followers were devoted followers. They could have just asked, where is the tomb? And that would have settled it.
Yeah.
Now, what about people might say that's just all legend? How do we?
Well, yeah. Let's talk about David Hume's objection, because I think that's an important one. What Hume says is, look, if you're going to claim an event that is highly unlikely, isn't it more likely that these guys are lying or mistaken? They're either mistaken or they're lying. Aren't those two choices more believable, more likely? Aren't the percentages of those ideas more likely than the tomb was actually empty or that Jesus actually rose from the dead? That was Hume's objection, that this is a one-off thing, and people lie all the time. People are mistaken all the time. So because they're mistaken all the time, isn't that more likely than this one-off thing? And that was an objection he offered in his On Miracles, matter of fact. And you really counter that one the way when atheists bring up Hume, and atheists love to bring up Hume all the time. I say, well, what do you do with the Big Bang? Because that's a one-off thing too.
Right.
Yeah.
So that Hume gets unplugged immediately because of the Big Bang, and of course he's assuming that there's no God. But if all you do is assume there's a God, then it all falls apart. C. Bayham McCullough, in Justifying Historical Descriptions, offers 7 criteria to judge an account, and it's number 1, a hypothesis must imply further statements describing observable data. Does it fit with the other observable data we know? Does it have greater explanatory scope? Does it have greater explanatory power? Is it more plausible? Does it handle different truths better? Is it less ad hoc? Do you have to make up additional stuff or not?
Sure.
Is it disconfirmed by further accepted beliefs? And then does it exceed any rivals? Those are the 7 criteria that McCullough offers. And those are, when you start looking at the resurrection account, even McCullough says that the hypothesis of the resurrection is greater explanatory scope and power, which try to account for the relevant evidence. But he thinks it's a little less plausible because it brings the supernatural in. But that's just again, the assumption is that there's no supernatural. If you assume the supernatural, if you assume there's God, that's the only thing that you need. So,
Right.
I think if it's merely a legend, the question then also comes as to why someone would die for it. Legends are good for entertainment, not for dying.
Yes.
And I think with regards to, you touch on that, the whole idea of supernatural, right? It could be a one-off event for sure. It's not science. The very characteristic of scientific engagement or analysis is repeatability, right? That's not what's happening here.
Yeah.
And I think we can't repeat this fact in history. What we can do is look around as to what came about because of it.
Right.
And I think when we do that, it only points to the fact that Jesus resurrected.
Right. And legends happen when you have major gaps in generations, when things are not passed from generation to generation. This one, the first recorded eyewitnesses and texts we have are so close to the events events they actually record. And from then on, it has been passed on orally and in written form. It's not really deviated from.
These were unique people too. If you see, these were not just random people from anywhere. They were Jewish people. They knew what it meant to actually situate their truth in the Word of God. So if they were creating legend, they would be going completely against what they actually believed in.
Plus, what legend does is it usually salves a need. So, for example, the infancy Gospels, the Gospel of Thomas and the infancy Gospels and things like that, where Jesus starts to make clay birds from nothing as a child. The need is how do we explain Jesus in this miraculous situation as a 5-year-old? What would and that kind of you put these kind of things in as a precocious child and it looks cute. That's not the resurrection account. He died by crucifixion. Okay, nobody's going to invent that. That's like, okay, I want to start a religion. I'm going to base him off of a pedophile. It was that heinous in the eyes of the public. You just don't create a new faith by starting off with your main character being that bad in position. That's not a legendary thing. And then you have the things like the embarrassing testimony. It's the women that find the empty tomb first. You would never have women in a Jewish context be the ones who are the primary testators of this issue, because they couldn't even testify in a court of law in Jewish circles. And so there's all those
And I will add
problems.
this too. So there is a legend about Jesus, which is found in Quran.
Yes.
Right? But that's 600 years after the fact. And not only that, much distance from where it exactly happened, away from the eyewitnesses.
Right, and what does it do? It takes Jesus off the
of
cross.
resurrection,
because,
exactly.
Because he can't be part of that cross thing. That's too ugly.
Yeah.
That's right. All right. Well, that's actually a good segue. I know we're going on a station break in a few seconds, but on the second half hour of our show, we want to cover some of the objections or naturalistic explanations that experts have offered or skeptics have offered, such as perhaps Jesus never really died and was rescued by Allah, and related to that is maybe it was a twin of Jesus that was hanging on the cross instead, or perhaps the whole thing was just a hallucination. Or one of the common ones that's popular today in certain denominations is that Jesus just rose in our hearts. So some of those things we're going to be discussing at the second half hour of the apologetics.com radio show. We'll catch you after the break.
All right, let's get back to the apologetics.com radio show.
Well, welcome back to the apologetics.com radio show, where we challenge believers to think and thinkers to believe. We are talking about the resurrection. And we had a rough start this evening, but hopefully we can cover a lot of what we want to cover on the subject of Jesus' resurrection. We're going to be celebrating it as a church worldwide in the next few days. So it's a big deal. If you are a follower of Jesus, this is a good time to tell others about Jesus. Because there's only a few events in the year in which people who are not church tend to go to church: Christmas and Easter. And this would be a good opportunity to invite your neighbor if you know that they have not attended church, or you know that they are maybe wanting to belong to a church, or to seek maybe meaningful things in their lives, perhaps, So what's this deal about this man, Jesus of Nazareth, 2,000 years ago, walked the earth and did some things, taught about the kingdom, did some miracles, was crucified on the cross, and then for 3 days was buried, and then on the third day rose again. What does that mean for us? What does that mean for the world, gentlemen? What's the significance of that?
If it is true that Jesus resurrected, then it is true as to what he claimed to be. He is who he claimed to be, right? And that matters. And he claimed to be God, one with God. So it would matter to us that we would actually follow him and be led by him. And that would impact our individual lives and the lives of our family. Not only that, even our nations. So all his claims will be right and true. That's the ultimate, outcome of believing in the resurrection. And if the resurrection didn't happen, none of this would matter.
Yeah.
And we have hope that what most of humanity has suffered with and dealt with in their lifetime experiences is the fact that the world is obviously gone wrong. There's something that's not right, that justice doesn't prevail. People aren't naturally good. There's suffering in the world. There's corruption in the world. There's both intentional and unintentional evil in the world. And we look for a way out of that. And traditionally, people have tried to, of their own merit, perhaps, or by trying to appease the forces of nature or trying to do something themselves in order to somehow either escape that cycle or lessen it. And Christianity is the only faith where God says, I will step in. I will experience your pain in the way you experience it in your stead. And because of that, we can know that even death is not the finality, and there is a better world ahead where we can escape those things.
I think one of the ways, gentlemen, that we can talk about the resurrection is that this is really the good news.
Yeah.
With capital G, capital N, good news. This is the gospel. As you were saying, I echo what you guys are saying. Jesus was proclaiming the kingdom. And in this kingdom, he invites us to be part of it because, like you said, the world is broken, and we kind of have that sense about it. And we have our longings. We know that there's something better out there, or that we feel like this life that we have is not all there is. Otherwise, why not just end it all because it's meaningless? But everyone longs for something better and internally knows that something is broken. And here's the God-man, walks among us, teaches us things, and teaches us how to live in this kingdom. And because he is the God-man, he can actually break the cycle of sin, and we trust him to take us to this kingdom of his. And how do we trust him? Because he said some things, like Jacob, you mentioned that. He said some things, and then he validated them.
Yeah.
And it kind of put his signature on it, his seal of approval. Look, everything I've said, it's done before your eyes. And sometimes I have to picture how that would look like today. Like, for instance, we watch Marvel movies, superhero movies, like Superman. Isn't it amazing that everyone, they know that those are the good guys. And why are they good guys? Because they do good things, and they've got the power and they've got the will to do it. And we cheer them on.
Yeah.
And if you think about it, Jesus was kind of like that only in the first century, right? But he's more powerful than any of those guys. So if we, as mere mortals, even in our culture today, we see in the movies and the stories we tell each other that those things are better, and we like that kind of world. Well, I mean, Scripture tells us we can't even imagine how good it is that God has for us, for those who've placed their trust in Jesus. So here is now Jesus 2,000 years ago is risen, and he promises that he would take us into this kingdom if we trust him. So that's really the significance, right?
Yeah, and in the way C.S. Lewis kind of puts it, right, the myth that came to be true. Perhaps this idea that people are projecting to be a myth is perhaps the longing in their heart as well. So if someone is asking, is it all to life? I think the resurrection of Jesus Christ says, no, there is more to life.
Yeah.
Death is not the end.
So what do you guys say to others who might, again, they have a hard time believing this? Again, Rudolf Bultmann would say, dead men don't rise. That's just his thing. Some of these higher critics, they have this presupposition that miracles just don't happen.
Yeah.
It just doesn't happen. So
But
they
the-
might offer explanations like perhaps that was an identical twin that was hanging on the cross. They just had a switching thing, and then when the identical twin is laid and buried, now Jesus comes and
Then they should be Muslims.
Yeah.
They should believe.
well, now Chapman, Mark David Chapman,
Yeah.
offered this idea, and he did it in as a thought experiment. I think we got to be a little bit fair to him. He's at UCI,
Yes,
I believe
yes.
he was out of, and what he said was, because we can't believe the resurrection event is so improbable that it's actually more probable if Jesus had a twin brother, who was long lost, separated twin brother, who was just finding his way back to his roots and heard about this itinerant preacher Jesus, decided to check him out, came into Jerusalem, just happened to come in around the time that Jesus is being crucified, saw him on the cross, and then decided to step into his place and claim himself to be the great. He says that the odds of that are better than Jesus being crucified. But what he's admitting a couple of things in this thought experiment. First thing he's admitting is that all of the other evidence is so good that it either has to be Jesus or this twin theory, because none of the other excuses, none of the other
to him that was the best explanation.
Yeah,
for him.
he said everything else. Yes, when you start looking at it dispassionately, the swoon theory and the idea of the wrong tomb and all these things, they just don't pass muster. They just don't. They can be ruled out. The Apostle Paul is, for example, how do you convert the Apostle Paul? Here's a guy who vehemently hates Christianity. He's going to round Christians up, put them in jail, or kill them. I mean, imagine, and I've used this example, I wrote about it in a book, where I said, imagine a Muslim in ISIS, a high-ranking Muslim official in ISIS, maybe the deputy under the ISIS head caliph, who is out there to, destroy the Devil West and put Islam in its proper place, happens to see, say, Forrest Gump, and becomes so enamored with Forrest Gump that he, shaves off his beard, changes his name to Bill Summers, and becomes a Presbyterian. That you just can't believe that somebody that's that deeply involved in his whole life in ISIS would do that for a fictional story. But Paul changes his mind, changes his life, becomes the primary proponent of Christianity, even suffering beatings and shipwrecks and all those things. How do you explain that if Jesus didn't appear to him personally and physically? You just can't. So Chapman is trying to say, but it must have been his twin. And my response is like, well, Mary was there. You think she might have remembered birthing two children? You think that might have been part of her recollection? I don't know, women. You guys tell me. When you give birth, would you remember if it was one or two? Yeah, I think so.
Even for them, it was an event that was beyond their own understanding, that they had to believe in it, was because from their perspective, from a Jewish perspective, resurrection was only eschatological at the end time, not in between. So even with Jesus' resurrection, for them to believe in that, it had to be true. Mm-hmm. It was not merely some story made up. It had to be true. The experiences that they had with the risen Christ were so real and factual that they believed in the resurrection that happened in the middle of the history, not just merely at the end of it.
Yeah. It's crazy, but there are some scholars who make this their PhD dissertation, the whole twin theory. But it goes against an agreed upon fact by virtually all scholars that James, who had been a skeptic, was converted to the faith because he believed in the resurrected Jesus, his brother. You wouldn't think that you would think that he would know that this is my brother and not some imposter claiming to
And
be
he
Jesus.
said, "Look at my hands and my feet. Stick your fingers in the holes."
Yeah.
I mean, it's pretty hard to fake that
Yeah.
in 30 A.D.
Yes. Okay, what about those who say the whole thing was just a hallucination?
Hallucinations are basically individual phenomena
Yeah.
most of the time, right? Or almost all the time.
Yeah, pretty much all the time. Yeah.
So the fact that Jesus appeared to 500 people that we read about in 1 Corinthians. Oh, is it 1 Corinthians?
Yeah, 15.
Yeah. So how did that happen?
Yeah, they're not all hallucinating at the same time at the
And
same.
that too in different locations
Yeah.
as well. It's
Yes.
not merely happening in just one place.
Yeah.
At the tomb, in the place where the disciples are hiding, even on the road to Emmaus. And
Yes.
so there are different locations, different timings, different people.
Multiple sightings.
It can't just be hallucination.
And again, what do you do with Paul? Why in the world would Paul have such a hallucination if he's out to, kill Christians for this heresy? If you really understand first century Judaism and how strictly they took their monotheism, this is just outside the purview.
And if it's hallucination, we should be able to do it again in some sense, or create that kind of hallucination.
Yeah, and
or have similar events.
Right.
Very frequent.
Well, also, if it's a hallucination, don't you start to, is it worth dying for? Don't you start to question yourself even before, the Roman sword? Because James gets beheaded very, very early in this whole thing. Peter is by tradition crucified upside down. All of the apostles are martyred. And you start to say, well, if it's an hallucination, maybe I better rethink this.
Yeah.
And you don't, and they're too definitive, and people can tell the difference between a hallucination and real life.
And for Christians, it's not merely the fact of resurrection, which does stands out.
Yeah.
It's the event in the center of our faith. But at the same time, it's not disconnected from other miracles.
Right.
The virgin birth of Jesus.
Right.
And the wisdom in which he's growing, and Father proclaiming that he is my beloved Son. And all those things are connected. It's not distinct from each other.
Plus, we've already mentioned, if it's a hallucination, then the body's still dead. And all the Jewish hierarchy have to do is pull out the body
present the
again.
body.
Look, you guys got it wrong. Here it is. They
Yeah.
don't do that. They tacitly say the body isn't there because they say, hey, say somebody stole it. So there's at least an admission that even the Jewish people didn't get the tomb wrong and said the tomb's empty.
Right. So that's a good segue to a couple related things that you mentioned already, Lenny. What about the explanation that the disciples stole the body? Or how about the authorities hid the body? Maybe those two. What would you say to those two objections?
The picture that we get about disciples is one not of daring disciples who are wanting to have now revenge. They ran away. They were not at the cross. They were not at the place where he had to be buried. Right?
They scattered like cockroaches,
and then with the
fearing
guards
for their life.
at the door, how would they actually go?
How do you guard? Yeah, how do you fight against the guards at the tomb? How does that work? And the disciples were incredulous at first.
Yeah.
Even.
Not only that, this is actually not original because it's actually in the text in Matthew. This is the first naturalistic explanation because the authorities did talk to the guards and said, "Hey," well, the guards approached them, "Hey," and told them what happened, and the Sanhedrin, the religious leader, said, "We're going to pay you. Just keep it quiet, all right?"
Yeah.
And say that the disciples stole the body.
And those are Romans. I mean, the Philippian jailer in Acts 16. Remember when the jailers were going to the jail doors were open and he thought everybody escaped? He was going to kill himself because in Roman law, their sentences all transfer to him.
Yeah.
And he knew it would be better if I just kill myself than face the consequences of that. So you're talking about 4 professional killers in the Roman army who were overcome by this ragtag group of fishermen who then moved the stone, drug out the body, and then knew it was a lie and still was persecuted for it. Charles Colson makes a very good point. He goes, you had the top people, most powerful people in the world in the Watergate scandal. And within 2 weeks, the fact that they were lying broke. And it leaked out all over the place because people will do anything to save their own necks. This never happened. Not one recanted ever and faced the more dire consequences from it. So it has a ring of truth that supersedes any other type of lie.
Yes.
And it doesn't make sense that the authorities would steal the body of Jesus.
No,
What for?
Yeah,
to start a new religion?
Yeah, that makes no sense at all.
A popular one for a while in the 70s, I think, was the swoon theory.
Christoph Flake. Actually,
Yeah.
he first offered it in the 1920s.
1920s, okay.
And it had some resurgences from time to time. But Romans are professional killers. Now you have a person who's been 3 to 4 hours on a crucifix, which kills people. That's the whole point of it. It kills them in the most painful, debilitating way, with no modern medicine, with no antiseptic, no antibiotics, losing blood left and right. And you're telling me after 36 hours, he is able to somehow pull himself off of a cold slab, wet, damp, push a rock that's up to 2 tons.
Well, before that, he had to unravel 75 pounds worth of embalming materials.
Yeah. He's tied up like a mummy.
Yeah.
And he gets through that, pushes a stone that's up to 2 tons out of the way.
Overpowering the guards.
The guards just let him walk through, stumbling, bleeding profusely, gasping, no food, no water, finally makes his way up to the disciples, knocks on their door, ready to fall over, and they say, a miracle, he's risen from the dead.
Yeah, our Lord and Savior. It's more like, quick, get him to the hospital.
Is that what you want me to believe? That has talk about being ad hoc, talking about having to add, right? We talked about McCullough's, that's why he says it just makes no sense. There's no explanatory scope. There's no explanatory power. It's just really pulling everything out of left field. That's just dreaming.
I have the quote if you want me to read it.
Okay, go ahead and read that. Okay,
Yeah,
so this
it's by
is
Chuck
Colson, the architect of the Watergate scandal.
Yeah.
So he was the hatchet man of Nixon.
Yeah.
And he got caught, spent some time in jail, became a Christian there, and this is
Started the
what he
prison
says
fellowship.
about the resurrection.
Yeah. He says, I'm quoting him here, I know the resurrection is a fact, and Watergate proved it to me. How? Because 12 men testified they have seen Jesus raised from the dead. Then they proclaimed that truth for 40 years, never once denying it. Everyone was beaten, tortured, stoned, and put in prison. They would not have endured that if it weren't true. Watergate embroiled 12 of most powerful men in the world, and they couldn't keep alive for 3 weeks. You are telling me 12 apostles could keep alive for 40 years? Absolutely impossible.
Yeah. That's great. I love that quote from Colson. I want to mention, because some might say, well, what about those monks or those suicide bombers? They die for a cause, so that happens all the time, right? What would you say? What would be the difference between that and the disciples being martyred?
Well, actually, they do believe the cause in which they're dying for, but their belief is based on something more tenuous, and they believe that they will. They believe in a hope of immediate reward, right? 72 virgins and things like that. And it's the only way in Islam that you can be assured of heaven, by the way. Yeah. And in any other aspect, if you're judged, Allah is capricious, and Allah will do what Allah will do, is the way they say it in Islam. If he chooses that, no matter what you've done, he puts you on the scales, and maybe your good outweighs your bad, but even if it does, he could say, no, I don't want you in my heaven, and throw you off. So, but they're sincere in their beliefs. Their beliefs aren't based on something historic, though.
Yeah.
Their beliefs are based on something ethereal.
So there are a lot of people even today, they would die for an idea, right? Yeah. There are a lot of ideological death taking place. But this is not what we're talking about.
Right.
We are situating resurrection in a historical milieu at a time that can be investigated, and there are facts around it, and we have evidences towards that.
The nuance in that question is because the skeptics are accusers would say that the disciples made it all up. So the difference is maybe the sincere monk or the suicide bomber, they would die for something they sincerely believe to be true. But no one dies for a known lie.
Yeah.
Right. So that's the main difference.
And all the disciples except one were martyred.
That's an important distinction between the monk that sets himself on fire or protester that whatever they do. Because the accusation is that the disciples made it all up, but they wouldn't die for something they knew they made up. They just say, all right, time out. I take it all back because here's the body. They could have just done
and there's
that.
a huge difference too, because Christ died. We don't die in the manner like a terrorist dies. We'll live in light of the fact that Jesus died.
Yeah.
Right. In so doing, if we are killed, if we are persecuted and tortured, we submit to God's will in that. So there's a huge difference in someone who is dying.
Yeah,
for
a martyr dies in doing something that advances his cause. Right, the kamikaze pilot flies his plane into the ship because he wants to crash the ship as much as give value to his faith or give value to his cause. And the apostles. They were simply dying because they were following Christ's model. And that's most martyrs in early Christendom. That's what you find, the world hated me, therefore it will hate you. And they persecute you because they persecuted me. And that was all that they needed, was that they were following Christ's lead. They were following Christ's example.
So I want to cover two more things before our time is up. I know we have about 4 minutes left. But with all of the evidence that's out there, these are, top-notch evidence, first-rate evidence. Why do you think we still have skeptics out there? Why can't they believe? Why don't they believe? What are you guys' thoughts on that?
Why didn't the Jewish hierarchy believe when they had Jesus right in front of them?
Yeah.
Because our stubbornness, our sin will somehow preclude us. Thomas Nagel had talked about belief in God, and he says some of the more intelligent friends I have are Christians and they believe in God, but I know that if I believe in God, I'm going to be accountable to him, and I just don't want the world to be like that.
Yeah. And Scripture tells us that Jesus claims to be the resurrection. So it's not merely an idea, it's not merely an event as well. Mm-hmm. It is the person of Jesus Christ, which demands his lordship over all aspects of our life. I think with people who remain skeptic, I think it comes down to the fact that they're not fully committed to submitting themselves to the lordship of Jesus. They still want to hold on to their own efforts.
And there was a famous debate by Bill Craig and Dominic Crossan, the liberal scholar, liberal theologian, and toward the end of the debate, because that was asked actually by, I think Buckley was the moderator, saying exactly that, with all of the evidence before you, Crossan, why can't you believe? And Crossan just admitted that it's his theological presupposition that God does not operate that way. So it's almost like the Rudolf Bultmann of the world, where dead men don't rise.
Yeah.
So they've already presupposed a conclusion, a priori, as we would call it, right? So it's hard for them to believe in miracles because it doesn't make sense to them. But and that would be another show, how we can overcome that. But in the next few seconds we have, gentlemen, how would you encourage our Christian, our brother, sister, during this time of Easter, where we all celebrate Jesus' resurrection? How can they be a better salt and light? How can they be better witnesses, knowing that we are, at least here in the West, celebrating Easter?
Yeah, one thing I would highlight is that we as Christians need to really believe in this, that resurrection is through the way of cross. Mm-hmm. So even in our life, we may have suffering and pain, but that's not the end. We have the hope of resurrection that Christ has offered, and he has demonstrated it factually through his own resurrection. We can rely on him, trust on him. And for those listeners who don't trust in Jesus, let me implore you, investigate, look at the resurrection of Jesus. I can guarantee you'll be convinced.
Yeah, it's not that Christianity works for me or my belief, this is my belief for me. It's that you need to believe Jesus rose from the dead in the same way you believe that George Washington was the first president of the United States. And it's not, well, George Washington was the first president for me. That's a silly statement. Or gravity is what I believe in for me, but for you may be non-gravity. No, it's as much of a fact of the outside world. And when you start with that, if you have that level of conviction and that level of understanding, then it changes how you talk to people. Then it changes how you embrace Jesus and walk with him, because he has that level of authority.
Well, thanks, Lenny. You have the last word there. If you want to know more about this Jesus we're talking about, you need to talk to somebody. Reach out to us. You know our website, www.apologetics.com. So you've been listening to apologetics.com radio, where we challenge believers to think and thinkers to believe. Our hope is that you've learned some aspect about the Christian worldview, especially the resurrection, that strengthens your faith and make you want to learn more. Special thanks to my panel, Jacob and Lenny, and to our intrepid sound engineers back there for making us sound good. Special thank you to your listeners. Until next time, good night.